I'm very, very happy to be introducing Barbara Herrnstein-Smith today. You guys all heard the introduction by Dale Martin on Tuesday, so I won't repeat any of that. Instead, I just want to recall the intense excitement that I felt in the early 90s when I was reading Contingencies of Value. And if I had known that I'll be doing the introduction today, I would have been jumping up and down. Then, for many of us, it is the landmark book, the major turning point in our thinking. But I think Barbara, as usual, has moved ahead of us and has gone on to other things, many other things. I especially remember two talks that she gave here, one called Sewing Up the Mind on Evolutionary Psychology, and the other, a paper given at a symposium in honor of Naomi Shore called Animal Relatives, Difficult Relations, that is now a chapter of her new book, Scandalous Knowledge. So I think it's fair to say that even though Barbara has been a Duke all this time, that she has been a vital and continuous presence at Yale as well. It is a great pleasure to welcome her, and today she's speaking on the new naturalism to evolutionary riddles.
Thanks very much, Wai-Chi. It's nice to be back again, and nice to see you all again. In the last lecture, I introduced and discussed some characteristics of what I'm calling here the new naturalism. That is, recent efforts, primarily by anthropologists and psychologists, to explain various features of religion on the basis of current findings in the natural sciences, notably evolutionary biology and cognitive science. I'm going to continue today to discuss these efforts, first by looking at a study by anthropologist Scott Atran titled In Gods We Trust, The Evolutionary Landscape of Religion, and then by reflecting on them in comparison with a work that is also naturalistic and also draws on evolutionary biology, but that represents a rather different tradition in the study of religion. And this is the book Creation of the Sacred, Tracts of Biology in Early Religions by the German classicist Walter Burkert. So I turn first to Atran. The title of Atran's book, In Gods We Trust, plays, of course, on the inscription on US coins, but in two ways. First, by pluralizing God, which marks this as a non-theological study, confessional polytheism being an unlikely possibility these days, and second, by suggesting that matters of economics will figure in the study, as indeed they do. Atran opens by posing what he calls an evolutionary riddle, namely, what maintains religion among humans in view of its apparent costs. What makes this an evolutionary riddle, he explains, is that the costs involved are effects of religious belief and practice, such as programmatic altruism and apparently wasteful expenditures of resources and so forth, that would seem to reduce genetic fitness. The answer to the riddle, he goes on to suggest, here in line with new naturalist thought more generally, is that many beliefs and practices associated with religion reflect the operation of innate cognitive mechanisms that were naturally selected because they secured fitness benefits for our Stone Age ancestors. But he adds, here more distinctively, many of those beliefs and practices also meet ongoing emotional and social needs for individuals and their communities, thereby continuing to yield important benefits for humans and making religion a powerful force in competition with science and other secular ideologies. Atran himself is a widely traveled, impressively informed anthropologist, familiar with the thought and literature of several cultures, many of them non-Western. This cosmopolitanism is reflected in numerous incidental observations as well as more studied reflections in his book, and it cushions through vivid examples some otherwise angular technical formulations. Although, as we'll see, his account of various aspects of religion is confined along certain characteristic new naturalist lines, it offers a significantly richer and subtler view of the phenomena it undertakes to explain, and a more sophisticated view of the general intellectual terrain that it occupies. A notable feature of Atran's assessments of the payoffs of religion, the term is his from game theory as applied to evolutionary biology, is his even-handedness in considering the more proximate effects involved. Thus, he observes that religion is not a single evolutionary entity, but the product of a variety of cognitive systems, only some of which are adaptive, and continues, quote, "Even those systems with an evolutionary history, whether as adaptation or byproduct, have often been culturally exapted to new functions absent from natural environments. And these functions may have little systematic relation to genetic fitness." Then he has a colon followed by a quite long list. "Encouraging xenophobia or opposing injustice, supporting ruling cliques or their overthrow, facilitating communication or con games, relieving or inciting anxiety, enhancing or suppressing sexual pleasure, promoting or impeding artistic creativity, fostering or hindering insight into ourselves and the world around us, seeking or inventing the truth, and the like," end quote. So this is quite a striking list, both in its substantive scope and in its clearly painstaking effort at balance, with each item from the standard catalog of all the achievements of religion matched against an item from the standard catalog of all its crimes. This continued balancing act is sometimes hard for Atran to manage and leads him to ignore or soft pedal certain features of religion that would get added bite from some perspectives to the debit side of his accounting sheets. For example, the long-standing clerical sponsorship of the confinement of women, which he doesn't mention here in line with old naturalists as well as new naturalists, I've observed. But his emphasis on the fundamentally ambivalent operation of religious beliefs and practices, for better or for worse, as he puts it later, is valuable as such, and there's much else to welcome here. Due acknowledgement of the heterogeneity of religious phenomena, a refusal of across-the-board adaptationism, and due recognition of the significance for understanding religions of the cultural environments in which they develop. Indeed, Atran's study exhibits numerous virtues of these kinds, which is what makes its participation in some of the more dubious moves of the new naturalism all the more disappointing where they occur. The extent of that participation is apparent early on. Thus, while Atran notes that given the variety of the effects of religion, we should not seek to explain everything about it as the product of innate cognitive mechanisms, his main point is actually the converse of that. Quote, "Where we do see a high degree of similarity among the beliefs and practices of people living in different cultures, then we may confidently posit the existence and operation of just such mechanisms," end quote. Indeed, he maintains, such cross-cultural convergence is, quote, "possible only because of the universal structural framework of the mind, which," he continues, "involves innate and modularized expectations about object movements, essential kinds, the intentional nature of agents, and so forth," end quote. So, through a more intellectually nuanced route, Atran's account of religion arrives at, or takes off from, a view of human cognition very much like the one that I examined last time in Pascal Boyer's book, Religion Explained. I'll be saying more today about that general view of cognition, but for the moment I want to stick with the passage from Atran that I just quoted a moment ago. Atran's leap here from the observation of close similarities in the beliefs and practices of different cultures to the confident positing of universal innate cognitive mechanisms is worth some attention, since it's a key conceptual move in the accounts of human behavior and culture offered by evolutionary psychology and in the explanations of religion derived from them. Expanding the point, Atran cites as evidence of the operation of such mechanisms the resemblance of the Egyptian phoenix to the pre-Columbian feathered serpent and comparable similarities between Irish elves and Russian fairies, and remarks, quote, "If we reject the unlikely possibility that these thematic recurrences stem from historical contact and diffusion, or are spontaneous instantiations of a set of innate religious forms," and he cites here Jung, "then how else could such apparent recurrences independently take place across cultures without specific and strong cognitive constraints? Question mark, rhetorical question. But these are not, as he implies, the only alternatives. Like the virtually universal metaphors, light and dark, battles and journeys, and so forth, examined by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson in their classic study, Metaphors We Live By, the recurrent symbolic content of folk beliefs may be explained without invoking diffusion archetypes or specific and strong cognitive universals, as the product of recurrent human activities and experiences under widespread human conditions. The sun rises and sets cross-culturally. People everywhere go on journeys. Snakes and birds are found together in many regions of the globe, and so forth. The recurrent construction of chimeras of various kinds, that is, imaginary creatures combining parts and attributes of known ones, no doubt involves the operation at some general level of species-wide cognitive capacities and tendencies. But the appearance of such creatures in the iconography and lore of spatially and historically remote and otherwise different cultures does not in itself require the positing of innate, highly specialized cognitive mechanisms, and neither does the cross-cultural appearance of more specifically religious motifs. Later in the book, associating our allegedly intuitive comprehension of the concept of gods with children's allegedly intuitive knowledge of grammar, Atran writes, quote, "Without such biologically poised competencies, the products of millions of years of biological and cognitive evolution, a child's acquisition of such a wide range of cultural knowledge in a few short years would be miraculous. This is also true for any adult's ability to network such a vast repository of detailed information in a mere lifetime, or for an anthropologist's ability to understand something of an alien culture in a season or two of field work," end quote. The argument here, familiar from Noam Chomsky's theory of language acquisition, is that to avoid believing in miracles of human learning, we must believe in a storehouse of inner competencies, for example, as proposed by Chomsky in the 1960s, an innate language acquisition device. But in the view of many contemporary language theorists and neuroscientists, my footnote here is to Phil Lieberman and Terence Deacon, the existence of such a device with the specifications required by Chomsky's theory would be hardly less miraculous. Atran's examples here of remarkable human achievements, learning to speak one's native language as a child, mastering as an adult the basic informational repository of one's culture, and as an anthropologist, gaining insight into other cultures. These are quite different and individually quite complex accomplishment, each the end point of an array of processes that occur over time. An adequate explanation of any one of them would seem to require, at the least, consideration of the types of experiences and developmental processes that might be involved, and relevant observation and analysis. Explanations of observed achievements in terms of posited inner competencies, however, like a language acquisition device, obviate the need for such theoretical and empirical activities. Or to put it the other way around, and it has operated this way in linguistics, such explanations foreclose such activities before they have begun. If you think the only alternative to a language acquisition device is a blank slate, all right, then you are quite confined in what you are likely to think about or look at or look for in the study of children's acquisition of language. I would also note that while Atran and other evolutionary psychologists typically stress the millions of years of biological evolution, they typically neglect the many years involved in the maturation of every human being, what Atran refers to here as a mere lifetime. To move on, though, to other dubious but instructive features of his general approach. A key element of the new naturalist explanations of Why the Gods Persist, which is the title of a book in the genre, is the idea that supernatural concepts are especially compelling because they involve a combination of intuitive and counterintuitive properties. For example, it's said, in being able to watch and hear us, gods conform to our innate categorical intuitions regarding what personal agents can do, so beliefs about them are easy to accept. But the argument continues, in being invisible and immortal, gods violate such intuitions, so ideas about them are striking and memorable. So, it seems, one way or the other, stories about gods are virtually irresistible to the human mind. The hypothesis is also signally non-falsifiable, since whatever you have, it's going to explain whatever you want it to. Although the theory is plausible in relation to a range of examples, its assumptions, quite aside from what I just mentioned, present a number of significant conceptual and empirical difficulties that I want to examine here because they are broadly important for the New Naturalist project. One set of difficulties involves the fundamental nature of what we call beliefs. As set forth in Atran's account, the theory of supernatural concepts reveals some strong but dubious rationalist presumptions that are evident elsewhere in his book and among new naturalists generally. By rationalism here, I mean a set of classic philosophic views about what is posited as a distinctively human faculty, reason, that operates independent of emotion or bodily sensation and is orthotropic, that is, inherently truth-oriented. Such views are dubious because, among other things, they assume a partitioning of human faculties, reason, sensation, judgment, will, and so forth, many of them very ancient indeed, that is hard to map onto current neurophysiological understandings of cognitive process. Atran's rationalist presumptions appear in his arguments for the claim that people everywhere recognize, quote, a principled distinction between intuitive and counterintuitive beliefs. I won't have a chance to pursue this, but he thinks this argues for a universal rationality that defeats relativism. But that's another subject not to be gone into here. But in support of this idea of a principled distinction between intuitive and counterintuitive beliefs, he observes first that if common sense and symbolic beliefs were processed in the same way, then the former, the common sense, would invariably contradict the latter, the symbolic. And second, that if symbolic beliefs were processed just like beliefs of brute fact, then, I'm quoting him, any conclusion would logically follow from any belief because people would assent to blatantly contradictory facts, end quote. Now, it may be the case that many of the cognitive phenomena we assemble under the term beliefs, from discrete verbal propositions to ongoing inarticulate behavioral perceptual dispositions, can be distinguished in terms of how they are processed neurophysiologically. But Atran's claim of a sharp and universal principled distinction between common sense beliefs about brute facts and symbolic beliefs about supernatural concepts is, I think, dubious on its face. And his observations here figure as arguments for that claim only if one is persuaded first that people can't harbor contradictory beliefs and don't assent to blatantly contradictory facts. I would have to say sociological experiments presenting Republicans and Democrats with blatantly contradictory facts uttered by their favorite candidates always notice the contradictions in the other guy's candidate and never notice the contradictions in their own candidates. It's a sort of finding that psychologists are always eager to relate publicly. And that's a quite recent study. So I say his observations about these principled distinctions operate if you believe that people can't harbor contradictory beliefs and don't assent to blatantly contradictory facts, and second, that a logical objection translates into a psychological or neurophysiological impossibility. My point here, in other words, to the point where you have to posit a whole machinery to make sure that there are no illogical contradictions of that kind. My point here is not just that Atran's arguments here betray a surprisingly old-fashioned rationalist logicism, but that here as elsewhere, the conceptions of belief fundamental to the new naturalist accounts of religion are in many ways ill-suited for the task at hand. Certainly for the cognitive psychologist studying religion, the possibility of the ready coexistence of beliefs that are logically contradictory is an important one to keep open. We recall such familiar but paradoxical or hypocritical seeming phenomena as devoutly religious evolutionary biologists, seriously philandering televangelists, and atheists who thrill to the divine comedy. In regard to just such phenomena, some notion of mental modularity seems useful, not, however, in the sense of hardwired categories of belief, such as so-called brute facts as distinct from so-called counterintuitive elves or symbolic plumed serpents, but in the sense of the ongoing functional segregation and context-sensitive activation and inhibition of various ideas and impulses. I'll say a little bit more about that in a bit. Other explanations for such phenomena, these seeming contradictions or hypocrisies, are also available. For example, apparently contradictory beliefs are evidently subject to modes of mediation, intertranslation, or, as it is said, reconciliation, that permit compatibilities that exceed the spaces of classical logic but are nevertheless subjectively viable. We'll see examples of these next time in efforts by some contemporary theologians to reconcile scientific knowledge and religious conviction. I would add that rationalist conceptions of belief as logically or illogically linked propositions become especially problematic in relation to the understanding of religion. Thus, Daniel Dennett, in his recent book, Breaking the Spell, that I'll be talking about more in the fourth lecture, Dennett, noting the violations of common sense in what he takes to be the relevant creedal beliefs, rehearses arguments they were made in the past by Hume and Freud, to the effect that ostensibly religious people, at least educated ones in modern times, can't and don't really believe their beliefs. Contrary to such arguments and to Atran's apparent suppositions, it could be maintained that logically or rationally speaking, our beliefs are always more or less incoherent, fragmentary, and conflicting, or as I call them elsewhere, scrappy, meaning in bits and pieces, scraps, and conflictual, like a fight, scrap. The evidence for such a claim is ample. Thus, classicist Paul Vane, in his book, wonderful book, titled "Did the Greeks Believe in Their Gods?" makes clear that an historically adequate answer to that question cannot be given in terms of such standard distinctions as real versus imagined, true versus fictional, or even the classic logos versus mythos. Similarly, Catherine Bell, a scholar of Asian religions, observes that belief in spirits among the Chinese exhibits widely varying types of conviction within as well as among individuals. She concludes, quote, "There is little to suggest that a belief in spirits is any one sort of belief. There is, in other words, very little systematic coherence," end quote. Or again, Robert Orsi, professor of religion at Harvard, reports his bemusement at finding that some of his students from what he calls Bible-reading homes, rather than simply rejecting their parents' beliefs, quote, have put together intricate Christian understandings that draw on neo-paganism, snippets of Asian religions, popular psychology, and contemporary science fiction, end quote. Comparable cognitive assemblages characterized by fragmentary, inconsistent ingredients with widely varying provenances, that is coming from all over, and significantly different modes, registers, and degrees of conviction that are context sensitive, have been documented and theorized by numerous other researchers and scholars. And of course, we're all aware of the diverse array of ideas and dispositions that we each carry around in our own heads, and I would add bodies. Emotion-laden memories and habits, creedal statements learned in childhood, individually worked out convictions that vary in strength and articulateness from one context to another, and so forth. In the face of such empirical and introspective evidence, the stalwart rationalism of many cognitive theorists is itself, I think, a notable phenomenon of human cognition. Other questions about the new naturalist account of supernatural concepts are raised by ethnographic observations that challenge both the sharp distinction between intuitive and counterintuitive properties and their joint association with specifically supernatural entities. Thus, anthropologist Maurice Bloch notes that among many people who worship ancestors, attitudes toward the latter are not very different from attitudes and even behavior toward living elders, quote. I enjoy this particularly. The motivations, emotions, and understanding of elders and ancestors are assumed to be the same. Ancestors are simply more difficult to communicate with. When rural Malagasy, in perfectly ordinary contexts, want to be overheard by the dead, they speak more loudly, something they often also do when they want elders to take notice, since these are often deaf. The ancestors are not as close as living parents or grandparents, but they're not all that distant, end quote. Bloch also observes more generally that attributes of gods, ghosts, spirits, or ancestors that are acknowledged by people in ritual or mythological contexts, that is, when that's what's being done and said, are often doubted or rejected by them under other conditions, for example, in professional or, for some of the people he has studied, formally philosophical contexts. Moreover, he adds, what was once strange, striking, and thus counterintuitive for someone, for example, the idea of a personal deity who is invisible, sees everything at once, rises from the dead, and lives forever in a world of spirits, may become, for the born again or otherwise converted, familiar, routine, and thus, for that person, intuitive. I want to insert something else here that is just a point about cognitive norms that I've written about before in connection with the animal paper that Dwight mentioned, but I think it has a pertinence here as well. Clearly not all cognitive norms, those so-called default settings in relation to which we're said to experience concepts as either intuitive or counterintuitive, are innate, universal, or hardwired, if any of them are. Many such norms, for example, those involving correct gender behavior, are socially transmitted and reinforced by individual experiences in particular social and cultural environments. Thus, either, why aren't those women properly veiled, or why do their women cover themselves up like that? These are felt as, very wrong, outrageous, objectionable, something very bad. We've been reading about it in the newspapers. Moreover, all cognitive norms, including those with arguably innate components, can be significantly adjusted, or we could say rewired. Sometimes this occurs as a result of expanded experience in different social environments, sometimes in responsive correspondence with other powerful cognitive norms, subsequently learned or otherwise developed. For example, in the case of headscarves, principles of individual autonomy or expectations of social tolerance. Contrary, then, to the idea that intuitiveness and counterintuitiveness are the inherent properties of concepts or the automatic outcome of universal cognitive mechanisms, it seems that the experience of an idea as either obvious or strange, proper or outrageous, is both culturally contingent and individually shifting. Finally, in this connection, we may note the difficulties involved in the identification of the combination of intuitive and counterintuitive properties with specifically supernatural concepts. Certainly one finds throughout human history, as well as across the globe, presumptively mortal beings who nevertheless appear to some of us to have been endowed with extraordinary and not quite human characteristics. Socrates and Shakespeare, Jesus and Gandhi, Alexander and Napoleon, Greta Garbo and Maria Callas. Geniuses, prophets, heroes, and superstars, fixed in the cultural heavens, their powers the object of our enduring awe and sometimes literal worship. As Bloch puts it, the counterintuitive is everywhere. But if, as seems to be the case, the supernatural is historically, culturally, and individually contingent, and the counterintuitive is everywhere, then where in particular, we may ask, is the new naturalist's religion? The answer, I would suggest, is that it is nowhere in particular, because everything that is said by the new naturalists to comprise it is found everywhere in human culture and experience. As I think is clear, I am sympathetic to the general, long-standing, ongoing project of producing naturalistic accounts of religion, but skeptical about many aspects of the particular approach I am calling here the new naturalism, especially the understanding of human cognition central to that approach. That understanding is not, in my view, completely wrong. Various features of the computational modular model are workable, I think, as formulated and modified by cognitive theorists less committed to the paradigm adopted from AI largely by evolutionary psychologists in the 1990s. Nor am I suggesting here that the new naturalist accounts of religion are altogether worthless or doomed to inadequacy, but they are limited, I think, by the theoretical assumptions and methodological allegiances that I discussed just now and last time. Conversely, those accounts are most substantial, persuasive, and illuminating when joined to empirically responsive studies of religion by scholars and researchers working with other approaches, both social scientific and humanistic. These include textual, historical, and archaeological scholarship and efforts to describe and understand religions from the perspective of those who participate in them. To illustrate some of these points, I turn now to another recent account of religion that draws centrally on evolutionary theory, namely Walter Burkitt's creation of the sacred Tracts of Biology in Early Religions. Burkitt's book, though thoroughly naturalistic, is not an example of what I've been calling the new naturalism. Rather, in offering a series of perspectives on religion without pretensions to hard scientific status itself, it underscores the promise of a biologically and otherwise scientifically informed approach that is also, in his words, tied to historical and philological research. Burkitt is not himself a psychologist or anthropologist, but a classicist specializing in civilizations of the ancient world, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, and others, as documented in literary, historical, and religious texts and revealed in archaeological artifacts. In these ways and others, his book participates in the long tradition of naturalist accounts of religion that I mentioned in the first lecture, which includes works by, among others, Hume, Nietzsche, Weber, and Durkheim. Burkitt is also, like Boyer, Atrin, Dennett, and other new naturalists, extremely knowledgeable about current research in paleoanthropology, primatology, population genetics, and game theory, as well as contemporary evolutionary theory. But Creation of the Sacred, originally the Gifford Lectures for 1989, was published in 1995, was written before and without benefit of either evolutionary psychology or cognitive science per se, and I would suggest without many of their costs as well. In his book, Burkitt explores ancient ideas of invisible powers and superior beings, analyzes recurrent patterns of cultural belief and practice, clustering around concepts of guilt and sacrifice, and discusses prayer, gifts, oaths, divination, moral commands, and many other familiar features of religion, all with continuous reference to general human perceptual and behavioral tendencies. And he refers these tendencies in turn to the capacities and responses, probable or observed, of early hominids, primates, and animals more generally. But he does not seek to explain any of these, either the religious behaviors or the cognitive capacities and responses, as products of hardwired mechanisms or mental modules. Moreover, while, like most new naturalists, Burkitt is attentive to recurrent types of belief and behavior, he's no less attentive, here more distinctively, to recurrent patterns of interrelated concepts, practices, and social institutions. Also, and here quite unlike most new naturalists, in describing and explaining ancient ideas and practices, he's concerned to register the ranges of their variation under different historical and cultural conditions. The title of Burkitt's book, you recall, is Creation of the Sacred, not Discovery of the Sacred, as Eliade and other theologically oriented scholars of religion might have preferred, but also not Mental Foundations of the Sacred, as Boyer, Atrin, and other new naturalists might prefer. I have time here to draw only a few examples from the book to make these points, but would recommend all of it as an exemplary work in the genre and a very engrossing read. In a central chapter, Tracking the Biological Origins of Ideas of Dominance in Religion, Burkert observes that the word God, or what we translate as such in various ancient languages, commonly means power, rule, and honors due. Religion, he comments, quote, is generally accepted as a system of rank implying dependence, subordination, and submission to unseen superiors, end quote. This includes the Christian idea of omnipotence, implicitly related to ancient views of social rank and honor, themselves connected to more primitive dominance relations among humans built on physical strength and height, which can in turn be traced back to fundamental patterns of ranking, pecking order, among primates and other animals. Such dominance relations among humans, Burkert observes, always include some form of mutual obligation, in effect, a social exchange contract captured by the formula found in ancient Persian texts, quote, the Lord, honored by submission, grants protection and ensures security, end quote. Burkert notes, in the wake of Freud, moderns will translate this pattern into psychological terms, explaining God as a father figure, or after feminism, he adds, as a mother figure. But he continues, we must go back further and account for the role of authority in both society and the structure of the psyche, and it's that combination I want to stress for a moment. A key point in Burkert's view is that power operates through what he calls a two-tiered structure. In submitting to God, one rises to power among mortals. As the Father bends to God, so he may expect his children to bend to him. This religious theater of power, he notes, still tends to manifest itself in the normal family structure. The common family structure, we could say. It's hard to say what's normal. He continues, quote, submission and sovereignty occupy the same hierarchic structure. Dependence on unseen powers mirrors the real power structure that is in the social world, but is taken to be its model and to provide its legitimization. In reality, while power games are played out in a continuous dialectic of aggression and anxiety, in the stabilized structures of the mental world, this duality has become neatly dissociated, producing fear of God or gods, along with constant readiness to attack and destroy lower humans, buffered by the good conscience provided by piety, end quote. This subtle but unsentimental analysis, one can quarrel with its details, it's the form of the analysis that I'm interested in here, recalls both Nietzsche and Foucault, Nietzsche especially in the idea of a dialectics of power at the heart of much human social life, Foucault in the idea of the interlegitimation of hierarchical relations in church, state, and family. An analysis of this kind, though drawing on evolutionary biology, is remote from the sort of mental mechanism account familiar from evolutionary psychology, and the dynamics it describes would be difficult to render in terms of game theory or rational choice models of human behavior. This is not saying that those models are useless or wrong. It's just saying that this is a type of analysis that it would be hard to render in those terms, which are generally accepted to be highly idealizing and in other ways perhaps not as descriptive as they are sometimes thought to be. I would note especially that in explaining the emergence of patterns of dominance and submission in religion, Burkert does not leap directly from primate behavior and presumed Stone Age conditions to the positing of innate universal human impulses or intuitions. Rather, he takes his way overland, tracing the many forms of social and political institution and psychological processes involved in the development of those patterns over the course of documented human history, always as opposed to inferred prehistoric human development. In a central chapter of the book dealing with guilt and causality, Burkert identifies another recurrent pattern of linked human experiences and behaviors, namely the temporal sequence, and he suggests projected causal nexus of catastrophe, guilt, redemption, and salvation. His outline of the sequence goes as follows. I'm just going to include some details here from some later elaborations that he gives. Quote, "The catastrophe or evil, for example, plague, pestilence, storms, earthquakes, or defeat in war, the common supposition that this is due to the wrath of a god, the mediation by the oracle, seer, priest, or prophet, the statement of religious and moral guilt, and thus assignment of causal responsibility, and the atonement through religious ceremonies, which are essentially acts of undoing, reversal, or restitution." End quote. The sequence is familiar, of course, from Homeric poetry, Greek drama, and classic theories of tragic form. But, Burkert notes, it transcends Greek civilization and may practically be called universal. In analyzing the pattern, he posits a commonality or continuity of human and animal experience, specifically the experience of being fettered or bound by bad things. As a certifiable, hospitalizable claustrophobic, I might have found this particularly resonant, but this seems to be what he's talking about. Just the general experience of being fettered or bound by bad things, literal physical confinement as in a trap or prison, or more general suffering, deprivation, or disability, not being able to do what one wants to go, and of seeking to achieve release, again, literal or more abstract. It is, he writes, basically a biological experience, and as such much older than humanity, but abstracted, allegorized, and elaborated in human imagination and culture. Part of what grounds an analysis of this kind empirically, but also makes it evocative and, I think, illuminating, is that it appeals to a familiar though complex subjective experience as well as to observed behaviors. Insofar as it does so, however, this is a type of biological explanation unavailable to the new naturalism, which is programmatically anti-phenomenological. That is, most new naturalists reject as useless or improper for scientific explanation descriptions of experience, general as well as specifically religious, from the perspective of the subject. The rejection reflects a set of controversies crucial at the turn of the last century in shaping experimental psychology as a discipline and rehearsed many times since in disputes over proper methodology in the field of religious studies. In the case of psychology, seeking to distinguish itself from philosophy and attain scientific status, the issue was the validity of the introspective reports of experimental subjects. Where the objective is to be objective, such data are, of course, problematic. In the case of religious studies, seeking to distinguish itself from theology, the issue has been how to establish its intellectual credentials as an academic discipline while preserving religion from being, as is said, explained away. Where the aim is to be friendly to religion, a phrase I encounter over and over. Is this friendly to religion or is it not friendly to religion? where the aim is to be friendly to religion, a phenomenological approach, meaning here both bracketing the question of truth, that is, suspending both belief and disbelief, and describing religion from the perspective of its practitioners, has seemed eminently desirable, or indeed exclusively so. For the new naturalists, themselves seeking scientific status for their evolutionary cognitive causal explanations of religion, the prevalence of the latter conviction, that is, the idea that religion is best or only describable from the perspective of the religious, has been a key frustration. So it's not surprising that they should reject such descriptions in their own work. Not surprising, but to a certain extent self-limiting. For as we saw last time in Pascal Boyer's dubious efforts to explain religious rituals, the experiences and interpretations of participants, which he sought programmatically to exclude, form a crucial link in precisely the causal chain of their emergence and persistence. This brings me to some general points regarding Burkett's relation to the new naturalists. In a final reflection on the sequence from catastrophe through guilt to expiation and salvation, Burkett observes, quote, "People are quite inclined to accept their own guilt, a readiness which makes the course of events understandable and offers a way to handle or refashion one's own fate, in contrast to the oppressive burdens of chance and necessity." And he adds in a passage of particular interest to us here, we'll go back to such passages next week, "Modern science will not easily prevail. People prefer to cling to the surplus of causality and sense, and there is no lack of mediators to explore the hidden connections, that is, to assign the guilt." The passage just quoted is clearly the product of a sophisticated intelligence. Like many passages in Boyer's Religion Explained, it's concerned with the power and profound sources of human irrationality. Its angles and idioms, however, are remote from those of Boyer and most other new naturalists, that is, from a concern with scientificity per se, and from a focus on the automatic operation of mental mechanisms. Moreover, precisely because here, as throughout the book, Burkett's journey from the psychobiological to the religious proceeds by way of an historically informed understanding of human institutions and behaviors, it is especially illuminating with regard to later, including contemporary manifestations. Thus he illustrates his last point here: there is no lack of mediators to explore the hidden connections with contemporary reactions to the AIDS epidemic, and one could readily add as further illustrations the scapegoating rants triggered indeed by the communal catastrophes of 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina. Comparable forms of explanatory power and contemporary illumination can be found for comparable reasons at various points in the work of the new naturalists as well. The contrast is not pure, simple, clear, and all the time. And so I'll illustrate that by going back to Scott Atran's book, In Gods We Trust, for some examples. The point is how it is that contemporary explanatory power and contemporary relevance are both secured by a kind of explanation that does not leap from the prehistoric to mental mechanisms, but takes its way, as I say, overland. In spite of the significant limits I discussed earlier, Atran's accounts of religion are, item for item, considerably richer and subtler than those in most other recent works invoking cognitive evolutionary approaches. These virtues are especially evident in his analysis of the communal effects of religious beliefs and practices, For example, how religiously sanctioned communal norms operate ecologically. In explicit contrast here to the idea of an inevitable tragedy of the commons, as elaborated recently by Jared Diamond with regard to the devastation of Easter Island, which Diamond suggests was the product of the environment destroying beliefs and ultimately suicidal rituals of its inhabitants. Atran evokes an environment and self-preserving spirit of the commons. Animism and anthropomorphism, embodied in religious norms, he observes, are generally conducive to a cooperative relation with the environment and thus to effective ecological management. For example, concerns about crops and animals transmitted through local myth and lore as preferences or punishments of the spirits may operate as instructive summaries of empirical observations of interactions between humans and other species over many generations. At the same time, and in defiance of how costs and benefits are figured in rational choice models of human behavior, members of communities with such beliefs tend to regard non-humans, from fish to forests, not simply as material resources, but as players in the same ongoing life game as humans. In other words, he's not rejecting the idea of game theory, but he's saying that what counts as a player in that game will affect what the payoff is for all concerned, and that if there is anthropomorphism and animism with regard to the natural resources, then you will have a different way in which the rational choice model will operate. So it's not just a matter of let's be nice and forget about all these economists. It is, as is often the case in opposing reductive economistic explanation, is counting the coins more carefully and being sure that what you're counting isn't always a matter of coins, because that usually isn't always what is going to be involved. Atran does not sponsor the sacralization of nature as a form of environmentalist prudence, as some do. In accord, however, with other ecological theorists, he observes that where it has existed, the projection of an intentional reciprocity between humans and spirits has preserved natural resources over time, where evolutionary pressures toward individual self-interest alone might have destroyed them. Although the cognitive mechanisms Atran invokes here, anthropomorphism, animism, projection, and so forth, are understood to have evolutionary histories, his analysis departs from standard new naturalist practice by considering closely the consequences of the interactive relation between humans and their ongoing and current, not just prehistoric environments, and also by describing the dynamics of that relation over historical, not just evolutionary time. Many generations, not the usual millions of years. The analysis that results is without mysticism, but certainly with insight. And though its generality may be questioned, it has considerable explanatory power and potential value for practical policy making. These insight, explanatory power, and practical pertinence seem to me to be important aims and achievements for a naturalistic account of religion. None of these aims, however, comes down to being scientific as an end in itself, and none of these achievements exhausts its value in being so, which brings me to a final example today. While the new naturalists generally, and some of them spectacularly, tend to be tin-eared and literal-minded, Atran's explanations of key features of religious belief and practice, including, crucially, their persistence, gain power from his attentiveness to the operations of religious language. He has two accounts of it, the one that I'm going to give you, which I like, and an earlier one, which I have a lot of problems with. That's simply to be registered for those of you who know his book well. Thus, at the end of the book, arguing, like Walter Burkert, that religion is unlikely to be replaced soon by science or other secular ideologies, Atran compares science and religion with regard to the fate of figurative language, metaphors, analogies, and so forth, in their respective accounts of the world. Although he invokes here, once again, the dubious idea, which I talked about earlier, of a simple distinction between symbolic and factual beliefs, his observations are, I think, otherwise sharp and certainly suggestive. He writes, quote, "Whereas science tends to kill the metaphor, that is, as science progresses, its own metaphor disappears as a metaphor. That which had operated metaphorically or analogically to explain something tends to drop out as it becomes more formulaic or as the explanation becomes simpler and more accepted. Whereas science tends to kill the metaphor, religion strives to keep it poetic and endlessly open to further evocation. In the case of religion, these meta-representational ideas are never fully assimilated with factual and common sense beliefs. They are displayed, discussed, interpreted, and reinterpreted as doctrines, dogmas, sacred texts, or norms that further illustrate beliefs and behaviors rather than describe the world. The fact that religious beliefs do not lend themselves to any kind of clear and final comprehension allows their learning, teaching, exegesis, and circumstantial application to go on forever," end quote. In Daniel Dennett's account of the persistence of religious ideas in breaking the spell, this unlimited openness to reinterpretation of religious language is cast as mystification pure and simple, a naturally selected trait of certain viral memes, that is, popular culturally transmitted ideas or behaviors, the incomprehensibility or openness to endless interpretation of religious language is seen as designed to prevent the clear understanding of religious ideas, thus protecting them from rational evaluation and helping to ensure their infectiousness and perpetuation. Although Dennett's account here and his invocations of meme theory generally are self-consciously Darwinian, it's doubtful as to how well they illuminate the operations of religious language with regard to the question at issue, that is, the evolutionary riddle of the persistence of religion. It's a set of questions to which I'll return next week, when we look at some theological responses to Darwinian theory and to the new naturalism, particularly in the work of John Hort, and also look at some contemporary views of the relation and future relations between science and religion. But I'll end here today. Thank you. Yes, I will take questions. I need to be able to see you, and I'd appreciate if you would just identify your field so I'll know where you're coming from and the context of your comments or questions. Yes.
I'm afraid my questions will illuminate my ignorance.
Ah.
Is there an example of a successful mental mechanism? You've derided the mechanisms for language and religion. I wonder if there is a successful model. That's my first question. The second question is, what are the talents or the tools that Burkitt brings to his book?
Okay. I should have a pencil. I'd appreciate anybody having, just so I can jot down the exact words of the questions, because thanks so much. They're all right. I've given examples of mental mechanisms that I think are that don't work, such as the idea of a language acquisition device as proposed by Chomsky to account for the rapidity with which children acquire their native language. And the question is whether there are examples of successful mental mechanisms. In the first lecture, I said, I believe that there are cognitive tendencies that emerge reliably in human beings. The whole question of the mental mechanism is a model of cognition, which I have a lot of trouble with. So again, it's not that I object to the idea of machinery. I like machines, and I think that humans are machines, and I think that animals are machines. I think that we've got to get straight, though, what kinds of machines organisms are. So that would be the answer. So I can't give you an example of a mental mechanism that I think works, because it is that notion and the just theory of cognition in which it's embedded that I am questioning more broadly. But that doesn't mean that I reject the idea. I invoke it very often. In fact, get arguments from people. I invoke very often, and will next time, a number of cognitive tendencies that I think are species-wide. How they get to be that way is, I think, a question for cognitive science and for behavioral science to answer. I am unhappy with the current state of the computational modular explanation of cognition as it was developed in the early 90s by Leda Cosmides, John Tooby, and popularized in works like Steven Pinker's How the Mind Works. That's where my opposition lies. Now, the second question was, what is it that Burkert has that makes him so good? What I was trying to suggest is that it's a combination of things. I mean, he's obviously just tremendously learned, but it's not the degree of learning, and it's not the fact that he comes from a humanities department rather than a science department. He's obviously made himself very, very thoroughly knowledgeable about biology and current work that would be relevant to an evolutionary account or biological account of religion. He does all of that is there. What he has in addition is simply both the habits, the techniques, and the desire to deal with human history over historical time, so that when we are tracing the tracks of biology to account for recurrent and contemporary, both ancient and, as he draws it up to the present, recurrent religious phenomena, we have the richness of recorded human history as part of what we're drawing on in order to give that account. Whereas in the new naturalist accounts, except where they depart from that, as Atran does, he is himself very well informed historically. That is, not just in terms of prehistoric inferences about prehistoric life and notions of mental mechanisms, but also where that is filled in. My word is going overland. It means not making the leap from what's inferred and posited to what's inferred and posited, but moving through what is known of human institutions, social institutions, political institutions, and being attentive to the way in which these vary in relation to the particular historical circumstances. All of that stuff, it's the thickness of that stuff that makes what finally emerges as his indication of a track from something known to something biological seems satisfying to me, seems to me to have both empirical adequacy and responsibility, and also evocativeness in the sense of, yeah, that's the way things happen, even if it didn't happen exactly that way, even if these details have to be filled in, even if his particular, what he's focusing on has some particularity. Nevertheless, that is consonant with my own sense of how things happen, how cultural institutions and human behavior does tend to develop. Thanks for the question.
Dennis Turner. I work in medieval theology, which means that I approach from even deeper levels of ignorance than the last question did. Can I ask an extremely naive question? It's this. You say that you think human beings are machines. Isn't this a very odd sort of claim in view of the fact that it'll be probably centuries before we can get machines to replace human beings?
I've been talking to your colleagues who tell me any second now we will have machines who do everything.
Strikes me as the sort of optimism you get from scientists when they're looking for large sums of research money. My naive question is this, that it looks to me, just prima facie, as if the other way around is more promising, that machines are imitation humans rather than that humans are imitation machines, or that human behavior could be explained on the model of machines.
Those are two very different things. Two very different things. Human behavior can be explained in terms of what is called roughly mechanisms. Certainly, that does not make humans into machines in some robotic way. I will talk about that a little bit next time, because the kind of...
I thought you just said that human beings are machines.
I said, yes, human beings are machines, and yes.
That just seems very odd. I mean, in view of the fact that machines are very much less successful than human beings are.
It depends upon what machines you're thinking about. One can think about organisms, one can think about a cell as a machine.
Maybe. Okay, fine. I mean, perhaps the question is
so,
too
no, but I mean, I don't want to make you, exhibit A, but it is the kind of clash of idioms that your question raises, which I think is of tremendous significance in trying to deal with the issues that the Terry Lectures were instituted to deal with. I think it's important to call these things, to recognize that that is what's important. A clash of idioms, a clash of a whole set of what it is that you would associate with a machine, what examples would occur to you, and also, because I do know where you're coming from, a whole set of issues, philosophical, theological, that are very, very complex. And when you hear humans are machines, I understand that you hear it against the background of those issues. I would want to say that I think you probably mishear me a lot of the way. Perhaps ultimately I don't go to the places that you would want me to go in order to deny that. But I think that for a good bit of the way, I don't have a mechanical notion.
I promise you, I didn't have any baggage with this. I promise you, it's a really naive question. Just in principle, isn't it counterintuitive to suppose that you can explain human beings by reference to machines?
But that isn't what's going on. It is not that human beings are being explained by reference to machines. It is that the idea of human behavior and culture being involved, being explicable by something that can be called a mechanism. All right. Yeah. That's not the same thing. A mechanism and a machine is not the same thing. A mechanism is the way something happens.
Yes, I thought machines were about the way something happens. But
but listen, there is logic even outside of theology, and so the fact that one is the same as the other does not make, in that case, you've reversed what belongs in what category.
Okay.
You sort of brought me up short by your remarks about language acquisition. There was a marvelous paper by a psychologist named Martin Seligman.
My old colleague from Penn, yes.
Okay.
I used to play poker with him.
In the dying days of behaviorism, in which he pointed out rather astutely that animals, and presumably people as another species of animal, are evolutionarily prepared or counter-prepared or unprepared to learn certain sorts of things during development.
Yeah.
And I would have thought that, A, that's well established, and that language acquisition is in fact an example of a cognitive process for which we are evolutionarily prepared.
I don't disagree with that. That is not the same thing as endorsing the notion of a language acquisition device.
Okay.
There's a considerable space between what you said, which I have in print affirmed. I said to raise questions about that, a device of that kind, is not to deny that there are dispositions that are species-wide in humans. They may not be restricted to language. I think they are not. I think we are very alert to social cues, very alert to the effects of what we do on other people. There are numerous ways in which the learning of a language could be facilitated by numerous ways that we have evolved. I have no quarrel with the notion that language is evolved or that it depends on evolved tendencies and capacities. The specific notion of a language acquisition device with the specifications that Chomsky requires of it, as he offered it in the, I guess, late 60s, has been severely questioned by, from the point of view of human anatomy to the point of view of paleoanthropology, how one thing could follow another.
Well, if I can couple this, perhaps you don't want it coupled with the more general concept of module. Let me toss you a hand grenade then and suggest that what you were really complaining about is the contemporary metaphor and not the reality of what we can observe about behavior.
We want to say that again? That in the idea of module?
Yes, I think you are not incorrectly criticizing what is in fact in the realm of metaphor, given our state of understanding of the brain, and not the process itself. I'm trying to get these disentangled in my own mind.
No, that's fine. It is, but we're talking about a scientific or an account that is offering to be scientific. It is a model, so it is a model that has modules. It has very particular ways of being characterized as domain-specific, as genetically specified, as universal. So there are a number of things that come along with the segregated as far as process is concerned, so that what happens in one module cannot affect what happens in another module, that they operate independently. This is a lot of specification that is built in, or at least that is asserted with regard to modules as defined in evolutionary psychology. Other notions of module have been suggested, which consist simply of saying, well, a lot of things happen together often, so we can call it a module. So there's a kind of packaging, what I call functional differentiation, context sensitive, which is different from domain-specific absolute segregation. There's Fodor's model, there's the particular way in which it was appropriated by Cosmides and Tooby. There are other people like Paul Griffiths, the other Paul Griffiths, who the philosopher of biology, not the theologian, who has also tried very carefully. Peter Godfrey Smith, also a philosopher of biology, of science, who's tried very, very carefully to distinguish many uses and not mutually consistent of the term module, both in different discourses, but also within evolutionary psychology itself. So the problems range from whether or not it's a term that is used, whether a certain amount of fastness and looseness within evolutionary psychology in order to explain things. So we use it, it's domain specific here, but it's more flexible over here. It's segregated there, but it's combinable over here. So there's that kind conceptual problem, and also the problem for a number of people. Here I reach the limits of my technical knowledge, but neurophysiologically doesn't seem to work with what is being investigated now in brain science. Yes. Thank you.
Can you see me now?
Yes, I can. I appreciate that.
Okay. I'm in philosophy of religion specifically. I agree with your objections against naturalism, the ones that you stated completely. But I wonder whether there is not even a more fundamental problem here, namely this. When I hear these statements, well, of course the worst one was by Dennett, but all the others in a lesser degree come down to the same thing. When I hear these statements that religion is this, religion is that, and specifically the emphasis is exclusively or almost on the cognitive function of the thing, I do not recognize religion anymore.
Mm-hmm.
This is not what I recognize as religion.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
The whole question is here that, number one, the assumption, the underlying assumption appears to be that any mental operation that cannot be reduced to a cognitive function that a naturalist can explain doesn't exist. Well, with this assumption, you cannot get very far. I would think that, for one thing, religion discussed that way begins to look like a science, which is the last thing in the world it is and it was. Religion is, in fact, very often closer to what Susan Langer, in her beautiful books on the nature of mind, has defined as feeling. And by feeling, she doesn't mean sentimentality, but she means the most fundamental activity of the mind, the one in which so-called cognitive and so-called appetitive functions come entirely together. If we, on the other hand, if we look at the statements, the descriptions of religion, I find by these naturalists, I find really amusing, because they are so far off base, so far off anything that even an ordinary person can recognize, that I wonder how they get these things. Take, for example, if you're willing to go beyond the 19th century scientists, look at, for example, what religion was, what it was in the Islam, in Judaism, in Christianity, in an earlier age, but also what it is in primitive societies, what it is in also contemporary human emotions. As far as I'm concerned, religion to me is certainly not a cognitive function, because I know darn well that there is not a single point of my religion that I can prove. There is an element here. Of course, then immediately you're threatened to fall in falling back upon a notion of faith, which must be, in a scientific language, either a science or a substitute for a science, a bad science. Well, that's not what it is at all. It's an attitude, an action of confidence. And I do agree with this very much, and that's where I think the truth is of this thing, that all religious acts have a cognitive element in them, and that without that cognitive element, there is no possibility of having a religious act. And the second point that is also implied, I think, by the strange word supernatural, is this, that the cognitive act is one that implicitly always carries a notion of transcendence. In other words, here is something that I can't explain. It may not be much, but I'm not able to justify it, but it is something that is more than what I have in ordinary life. And finally, as a final remark, because I'm speaking too long, but as a final remark, I would say, where in all this approach of the people that you have been refuting and that I'm happy to hear refuted, where in all this is place for what is the quintessential element of religion, mainly the mystical experience?
Okay, well, thank you for that set of comments very, very much. The third, I will refer to my first lecture. I don't think you were you here? So I did mention that as in Eliada's analysis, and I said why it is that the naturalistic explanation is rejected from various perspectives and with regard to various phenomena, and very often it is said that it misses the main thing. In Eliada's term, it was the sacred, otherwise it's been called the numinous or the transcendent. So those who believe that a naturalistic explanation is intrinsically inadequate, as people do in various fields, that is, I know what would be said. So I simply acknowledge that certainly is a perspective. Your second point, I'm moving in the opposite direction, is you were using the word cognitive, and you said that there's an essential cognitive element and that it is a recognition of transcendence or the unknowable. I think cognitive, you'd probably agree with this, is being used in a different sense here from the way in which the cognitive explanation is being given. That is, you're using it, I suppose the way I'd use the word epistemic, just with regard to a certain kind of knowledge, and it's a knowledge of. Is that correct? So just to establish that meaning of cognitive is different from the way in which it's used in cognitive science, which is not just concerned with knowledge. It's gone pretty, it's hard for me to know anymore what cognitive means, given that it expands and contracts. But the first thing that you said, I want to agree with very much. And it is my objection to Dennett, and I won't have a chance to talk about it as much as I would want to. But yes, I don't recognize religion either from the description of it, and that's what I was connecting too rapidly to what I'm calling the rationalism, and to the very notion of belief and how belief operates in religion. The rationalism is partly a notion of examining beliefs as if they were propositions. There are many other ways to understand what a belief is. I mean, even quite apart from any religious notion of faith. Secondly, by his analysis of religion or his arguments about religion, which focus only on creedal propositions, is indeed missing what figures operates clearly. For most people who lead religious lives and for whom religion figures centrally as what matters, the creedal propositions and talking about their logicality or what their relationship is to one another logically is just missing what is mattering. If he has refuted them all very, very carefully, he will not have achieved very much if that's what But Dennett, who is very strange this way, he also says in Breaking the Spell, which, it's just stopped me, he has this notion that if only reason, he believes that reason is universal, and that if the Ayatollahs got together with the popes and the rabbis and all sat around the right-sized table and argued about these things rationally, that they'd come out to a rational conclusion and everybody would agree and go home, because then we'd know what was the case. For anyone, given his history and given what he spends his time doing, to still have such a naive notion about how anything in the world operates was just told me that he spends maybe too much time with philosophers.
I'm going to suggest that we continue this conversation over our lovely reception. There's some good food and drinks out there. And let's thank Barbara for this interesting one.